Mayang kalikasan sa inyong lahat. That is our Filipino greeting, which one may translate as a pleasant environment to all of you. And that will hold true whether it is morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are on planet Earth. We are pleased to welcome you to this first episode of our new program, Climate Action and Sustainability for Us. In short, CAS, without an H, for you. CAS for you. And you can see that we have two logos here. Let me make that bigger. One is for CASA, that I will introduce to you in a little while, which stands for Climate Action and Sustainability Alliance. And the other one is the sponsor of this broadcast program, one of the social enterprises that we are setting up, Social Enterprise on Education and Communication. We hope that we will have as audience for this broadcast program, which we are starting today, students, especially those who are working on research projects that we can help them focus on climate change and sustainable development, professionals who are in the field of environment and sustainable development, because we already have sustainability offices in many corporations, and policymakers at the local and national level, and friends even abroad who are also involved in these two important topics, climate change and sustainable development. So let me share with you the presentations that we have prepared for you for this episode. This is a photo that was taken by a good friend in the photography field. And you can see here clouds looming over a coconut plantation. As we take our journey to a rich, and by that we mean regenerative, inclusive, climate resilient, healthy, sustainable development, we face a fast-growing climate crisis that will not only affect the success of our journey, but also our survival. So we invite you to join us to think hard and well, talk together, and collaborate as much as possible, and act now. This is your host. My name is Cora. For those of you at my age level or older, I am convener chair of CASA. And for those of you who are younger, you may call me Dr. Cora, but I'd like to let you know that I am not a doctor of medicine. That might be the most important professional nowadays because of this COVID pandemic. My doctorate is in a field that I used to be asked what it covers, because it was very new. Engineering economic systems, which is a combination of engineering and economics. But about 3 to 5 years after I graduated, my school integrated 3 departments, the EES, our original department, Industrial Engineering and Operations Research, and that is now called Management Science and Engineering, which I think is the most popular course now at Stanford University. I will not go over the others here because you can download this whole video afterwards and read it. Okay, what will this episode cover? First, we'll share with you a brief history of CASA. Then we will also introduce what we mean by climate action and sustainability. Then share with you CASA's vision and major strategies and our priority programs in 2021. And launch today our broadcast program, which is CAS, again, without the H, for you, CAS for you. The topic of the first, my voice is not cooperating these days. I realized that if you talk a lot, you get a hoarse voice. But if you don't talk also, which has been happening because of this lockdown, I don't have many people to talk with, then you will also have a hoarse voice. And that's what I have now. So apologies. So we will discuss in this first episode and the succeeding ones, ENCA, Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting. And our first set of presenters, we chose for you the best whom we can find in the Philippines and the United States. We have 3 presenters plus some members of their team. Okay, so let me share now a brief history of our CASA. This group grew in the Management Association of the Philippines, which is the leading management association in our country. From the MAP Environment Committee to the MAP Sustainable Development Committee over 30 years until 2020. But in January 2021, our new board of the MAP decided to focus on the climate crisis. And so we created the MAP Climate Crisis Committee. But the challenge really is to address the climate crisis within the context of sustainable development. And since we already have several sustainable development projects, we decided to create the climate crisis and sustainable development network so that we can also include our partners who are not members of the Management Association of the Philippines. But as we started to work, we realized that we really need to advocate for action now. So what we are trying to advocate is a change in behavior so that our climate change, which should always happen because that's a feature of climate. Climate change is a natural phenomenon. However, it is giving us adverse effects now because of the way we behave. And so since we are advocating for improve or change behavior, we really need to consult the experts on this. And one of them is, let me see, Professor Einar Kringlen, who served as head of the Department of Psychiatry, is a medical doctor and psychiatrist at the University of Oslo, and also served as former fellow at the Stanford University Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. He also was knighted first class of the Order of Saint Olave in 2002. He said that stimulation, a small amount of stress, increases an individual's ability to react rationally. However, once the tension passes a certain threshold, fear and anxiety set in and have an adverse effect. Individuals regress to conventional reaction patterns not suitable in the new situation, rather than becoming engaged in finding creative solutions. Fear of the enemy is intensified by propaganda and political pressure. Tension increases. All or nothing solutions become the focus. Any action begins to seem better than no action at all. The urge to act can be so strong that actions are taken even if the consequences could be disastrous. we really have noticed that in a crisis, the common reactions are first, do nothing, accept it as an act of God. For example, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, people say, well, these are acts of God. And that's why it's not easy to bring out people from areas that are affected by volcanic eruptions, because that is supposed to be volcanic eruption is an act of God. Or another reaction is do something, decide and act hurriedly, but oftentimes not rationally. But what we want to do is to encourage all to think hard and well, as we said earlier, talk together and collaborate and act now rationally. So we have decided to transform our CCSDN to CASA, which in the Spanish language that we are quite familiar in means house or home. In the Italian language, it's definitely home. And so CASA is our home, which we hope will remind us that our only home in this multiverse is our planet Earth. And we are translating CASA as Climate Action and Sustainability Alliance. And you have now our logo, which was developed by my only daughter, Pastor Liz, after much pressure from the mother, after also the help of some people like my only son, Toby, and one of our CASA members, Jed Belen. Thank you all very much for our logo. And the other one, which, as I said, is a social enterprise, and we'll tell you more about what we are trying to do with social enterprise. This is SEEC, Social Enterprise on Education and Communication, that is sponsoring this webinar. This is actually the broadcast program, which will be composed of several episodes, we hope. So why do we have to worry about climate action when there are just many things to act on now? In fact, we have many crises. And not only the climate crisis, we have the energy crisis that is looming. We have other types, all sorts, governance crisis. And so why do we have the question, why do we have to worry about climate action at this time? Well, all regions of the Philippines are vulnerable to climate change. You can see in this map that the orange is the most vulnerable. The more orange, the more vulnerable, and the whole Philippine map is almost orange, except for the later part here that is lighter orange, but the one above in the northern part that is darker orange. And so we are faced with a lot of climate risks. And what are they? Let me share this map, the Philippine Exposure Map that was developed by a team led by our one of our members, Towns Awardee, Dr. Laura David, who now heads the University of the Philippines Marine Science Institute. Together with her team, Borja, Villanoy, and Alino, I think they're all doctors also, they developed this Philippine Exposure Map by dividing the country into clusters. So for example, you have here cluster 10, and you can see that they have identified the main climate change risks that impact or that are faced by the local communities in this cluster. So in cluster 10, extreme heating events, increasing ocean temperature, extreme rainfall events, disturbed water budget, and sea level rise. So the other aspect of our name, we said climate action and sustainability. Sustainability or sustainable development is the other portion, and we have here the 17 sustainable development goals that we and other countries in the United Nations have committed to address. We have from SDG number 1, no poverty, to SDG number 17, partnerships for the goals. We have also 13, which is climate action, and now we have to give more importance on this more than ever is good health and well-being because of this COVID pandemic. Well, it is not easy to remember all of these 17 SDGs. So what we have tried to do is we borrowed this stool from Shell. Perhaps they don't even know it because their original stool had 3 legs and we have added the 4th leg. And we'll explain to you what we have done with this. In the original definition of sustainable development, there are 3 pillars. The first is the social, which we are translating to people, and all of the P's associated with people, like peace, partnership. And then the second pillar is environmental, which we are translating to another P, that is planet. And then the economic pillar, which is not only on profitability, but prosperity for all. So what we have added here is the individual pillar, the person. That means you and I. And sustainable development actually should start from each one of us, from the person. Now, that stool with 4 legs, with 4 P's, makes the definition a little bit more trendy because Filipinos are very familiar with the 4 P's of the Department of Social Welfare and Development. They have a different meaning for the 4 P's, but for us, we have person, people, planet, and prosperity. So now, let me share our vision of CASA. A man, that's another acronym, which means Maritime and Archipelagic Nation, taking a successful journey to a rich, again, regenerative, inclusive, climate resilient, and healthy, sustainable development. And our mission is to help this man, the Philippines, take its journey to a rich, sustainable development through initiatives that are developed and implemented with the people concerned and in partnership with other stakeholders. Now, let me share with you some images about the Philippines or on the Philippines, especially for those friends of ours who are members of CASA from other countries or others with whom we will be sharing this video who are not familiar with the Philippines. The Philippines is composed of 7,641 islands, but we have more water. These islands are surrounded by water bodies, and there are beautiful water bodies and islands. For example, this big lagoon in El Nido Resort is a major tourist attraction. So we have different islands there. Some are small and some are big. What is very important for us to remember is that the Philippines is in the world center of marine biodiversity. And we're fortunate to have the center of that marine biodiversity in the Verde Islands. And let me show one of the beautiful marine biodiverse areas in the country. This is Tubataha Reef, and I just got a portion of a big image that noted marine photographer Tet Lara has taken in Tubataha. That's one of our beautiful places here. But we also have lands. We have 1/5 of our territories is composed of lands. We have beautiful trees still like this, old tree, although deforestation has become a serious concern in our country. And we have here what I call self-supporting bamboo. But now we are already nurturing them. We're not just letting them to grow on their own and become self-supporting, because we realize that they have many uses. So what are our major strategies? Let me share with you the major ones. We have more than this, but these are the major ones. Manhood. As we said, the Philippines is a man. And I hope the women here, our friends, well, that includes me, will not be so, so bothered by the fact that we say the Philippines is a man. Okay, CAS, climate action and sustainability. Urgent climate action must now be taken to avoid, reduce, and manage adverse consequences of climate change within the context of a rich sustainability. Science-based. We want to use science-based strategies and approaches, like, for example, the design thinking process, which was also developed at Stanford University with these steps. Empathize. We have to start by understanding what the concerns and issues are of the people and empathize with them. Define, ideate, prototype, and test. So those are the initial. Okay, here are others. I introduced to you SEEC, which is a social enterprise. We're using social enterprises as vehicles for our journey toward rich sustainability. That is to address social concerns while providing economic opportunities for those who are the beneficiaries, as well as those who are working to address the social concerns with them. And as I mentioned, SEEC is the first social enterprise that we are putting up, that is on education and communication. And we have several already in the pipeline that we are acting on. Because we are tired of raising donations and grants, we really have to be able to do this work by not depending on the donations of other people. Then we want to give importance to special groups like the youth, the hope of our fatherland, and I hope there are many students who will really watch this and the succeeding episodes. Senior citizens, well, like me, women, indigenous people, and other special groups. They are all included in the I, which is being inclusive of our sustainability. And partnership, those who have at least 2 of the 3 W's are welcome to partner with us. And what are those 3 W's? Willingness to work, wisdom with understanding of climate change and sustainable development issues and concerns, and wealth, well, not necessarily monetary wealth, but experience, technologies, and of course, CASA and in-kind materials, networks, and other resources that are needed for taking actions. So let me share some of the priority programs of CASA in 2021. We are halfway through the year, but we have already started most of this. Ecosystem and natural capital accounting is a major priority. And we have assisted the office of Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda, who initiated a bill similar to this, PINRA bill. And we just made some highlighting, especially of natural capital. So it is now called Philippine Ecosystem and Natural Capital Accounting System Bill, which Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda has filed as House Bill 9181. That has already passed the first reading in our Congress. Then we have reforestation with development program. We believe that reforestation should always go with livelihood opportunities for the people in the area, around the area. Otherwise, the trees that we will plant might not last long. Bamboo for food is a priority, and bamboo for energy. So for reforestation, we're really seriously considering bamboo because we have about 80 species of bamboo in the Philippines. The total global species, I think, is more than 1,500, but we have about 80 of them that have been with us for many years, since we were born. Then social enterprises, as we mentioned, and we have another social enterprise that we are putting up. We have started working on this, Rich and Smart. That is a marketplace, and the other social enterprises. Then we have this CASA communication program. We're developing an electronic book on ENCA, which we are featuring in this first and succeeding episodes. And we are setting up a cast channel in YouTube and in other social media platforms. And we are using other media like print and others. Then Kalinga para sa IP program, which we started under the Management Association of the Philippines with a village for Aita. That's a tribe in Bamban, Tarlac. We have completed that with the help of Master Planner, my friend who is one of the top 100 urban planners in the world, Architect June Palafox. And then we have already identified a group of women weavers that is being led by one of our most industrious members, Sheila, who is the leader of this 50 women Tinalak weavers, the Tiboli in Lake Cebu. And we have Mangyan. We have not started dealing with them, but Mangyan tribes in the country, mostly in the Occidental and Oriental Mindoro areas, are very much advanced in their dialect and in their weaving, very industrious also. So these are our special groups. We have others in other areas. We have about 7 areas that we are working on at different stages of development. This is an image that I am pleased to share with you because I took this photo. Okay, Kalinga IP program. So this first one, this tribe is composed of indigenous people in the Cordilleras, the Igorots. But one of them is not an IP. This guy here at the end used to be my driver, and he wore this attire, the chaleco of the Igorot. Okay, so today we're pleased to launch this broadcast program, CASA's broadcast channel. We started working on this in June, our Environment Month, and July, our National Disaster Consciousness Month. It took us a long time to finish this first episode because of a lot of sad and happy disturbances. The sad one is that some of our relatives and good friends have departed this planet Earth directly or indirectly due to COVID-19. And the new variants are already also affecting some of our members. So that is really the I used to say I am in the middle, I'm in the dumps. But then my pastor daughter said, in the middle of a miracle. Okay, so we are still in the middle of a miracle, and that middle sometimes is quite difficult. We have many challenges. Even my computer started to give way, so I had to buy a new one, relearn the softwares, etc. But so we now welcome you to our Climate Action and Sustainability for Us program, or in short, CAS, without an H, for you, CAS for you, so that we may all think hard and well, talk together and collaborate and act now. What do we aim to do through this program? Well, first, we want to share information on climate change and sustainability. For example, the factors affecting them that are within our control. And of course, including those that are not within our control. But we should really identify well and focus on acting on those that are within our control. Motivate all to think hard and well, talk about the issues and concerns, collaborate together, and act positively now on climate change and the sustainable development goals, and to recognize and feature best practices. Let me give an example of what we have done. We directed the climate change adaptation best practices in the Philippines book of the DNR. Here, I interviewed about 100 organizations, half in the public sector and NGO, and half in the business community, with each one of them sharing with us their 3 best practices on climate change adaptation. And this is a big book that the DNR funded by the UNDP and UNEP printed 1,000 copies of and distributed them to local governments, national government agencies, schools. So that's already now out of print, but you may be able to access a copy in one of the libraries that we have, or some of the LGU offices and national government agencies as well. So what we want to do is something like that, but on climate action and sustainability. What measures are we now taking, or we hope that we'll initiate, if you are not taking any action yet, that we can share with others, if only to help us monitor the progress of what we are doing, and also to inspire others to join us in this journey. So now we are starting with the first of the episodes on our electronic book on ecosystem and natural capital accounting. And we are pleased to have with us for this episode 2 leading scientists from Stanford University and our very own champion in Congress on environment and sustainable development, the Honorable Loren Legarda, Deputy Speaker of our House of Representatives. She represents the Lone District of Antique and was a 3-term senator before. That's the limit for senators. And she obtained the highest votes in 2 of the elections that she was a candidate at. She has received several international honors and awards, like the UNISDR Global Champion for Resilience and the UNEP Laureate honor, and others. She took her BS, Bachelor of Science cum laude at the University of the Philippines, a National Defense College of the Philippines top-notcher, and a graduate of the Command and General Staff College of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. She has a military rank as full colonel of the Philippine Air Force Reserve Force. She was honored by the University of the Philippines with a Doctor of Laws honoris causa and knighthood by 2 countries, France and Italy. And she is a Towns Awardee, the Outstanding Women in the Nation Service, which is granted to outstanding women every 3 years. The next one will be in 2023. And we have several members of the Towns Foundation or Towns Awardees in our CASA, starting with Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda, Dr. Laura David, whom I introduced earlier, yours truly also. Okay, so we now will hear the equivalent of the forward of our electronic book and also opening remarks for this first episode.
Humans in the past have lived in small tribes, communities, and clans. When they started flocking to cities, the challenge of governance gave leaders the opportunity to define measurements to see how well people were actually living. Alas, the measurements that were invented never really reflected what they were supposed to reflect. We have, for a few years now, been a majority of humankind that live in cities. And our economic rubrics, which have started to dictate the values our institutions hold, have brought us to the precipice. It has become so impossible to ignore the climate crisis that even the House of Representatives has declared that this crisis exists. So while some numbers are getting better, such as the number of people lifted out of poverty, those very people will be thrown right back into destitution due to this crisis. It is like saying the seats in the train are comfortable and bolted tight, but the train is still going to get derailed. We will have to apply multiple brakes and rail changes. For the first brake, it will be a wasted United Nations decade of ecological restoration if we do not put a stop to the destruction of all remaining natural areas. The second brake is the PENCAS, valuing the ecosystem and natural capital, the resources that keep on giving. It will make us realize that we are spending budgets to destroy the Earth's capacity to feed and clothe and house us, but not to help keep it doing so. But we need to understand that this accounting does not mean those values can be paid for or can be easily replaced. Nature, habitats, ecosystems are divinely created and should continue to exist. If we could afford legal rights to corporations for the pursuit of profit, why is it so hard to accord legal rights to things that will continue providing us with what we actually need? And this is why PENCAS includes a rights of nature provision. There are many other levels and buttons to push so that the earth will continue to survive and thrive. We just have to know which direction we are all pulling towards. And it is not just the short-term economic gains, but the long-term economic and ecological outcomes that we should actually look at. The point when we see these two converge is a time we will see our way through to actually thriving. So everyone interested in economy, ecology, science, nature-based solutions, culture, and life, I invite you to dig into this ebook and open your eyes to a new planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda, for that inspiring opening remarks, which will be the foreword for our electronic book on ecosystem and natural capital accounting. We welcome you back to our first episode of our communication program, Climate Action and Sustainability for Us. CAS for you. Again, I'm reminding you that doesn't have an H. And we are doing this for CASA, Climate Action and Sustainability Alliance, and our SEEC, the first social enterprise that we're putting up on education and communication. We will now go to the presentation of technical papers, and we are grateful to have with us, assisting us, helping us, like, as I said, guardian angels in the article that I wrote recently about this topic. The leading scientist on natural capital accounting, not only at Stanford University's Natural Capital Project, but also in the world. We have the topic now, the first topic that we shall discuss with them is the questions of natural capital science. Stanford University's Natural Capital Project co-founder and faculty director, Dr. Gretchen Daily, will explain the machinery of nature and the questions of natural capital science. For more than 2 decades, Dr. Daly has pioneered the concept of natural capital, advancing science and tools together with decision makers to integrate the values of nature into development plans. She will be joined by NatCap co-founder Dr. Steve Pulaski from the University of Minnesota and NatCap partner collaborator Dr. Gary Peterson of the Stockholm Resilience Center. They will underscore the importance of a natural capital approach. I will introduce only Dr. Gretchen Daily in detail for now. In the future, we hope that Dr. Steve Pulaski and Dr. Gary Peterson will also give us more extensive discussion of not only the approach, but also how they have used this in the respective areas in the University of Minnesota and at the Stockholm Resilience Center. So let me introduce now Dr. Gretchen Daily. She is, as I mentioned earlier, faculty director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. In addition to her expertise on natural capital, she is also an expert in biogeography. That is one field that perhaps I am introducing for the first time to those students who are watching us today. And I hope that you will explore this field. If you are just about to enter college, I hope you will take this up. And I hope there is somebody who is teaching this now in the Philippines. She is a professor in biology and director of the Center for Conservation Biology and senior fellow of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. She, as I mentioned earlier, co-founded the Natural Capital Project at Stanford. Her current interests cover land use, biodiversity dynamics, and ecosystem services. She has written lots of papers, but I chose this one because this is a topic which I hope we will also discuss in one episode because it is such an interesting, complicated topic, gross ecosystem product, to value nature in decision making. She works with both public and private policy and decision makers, and she has received almost all of the top global awards on environment and economics. The Sophie Award, the Volvo Environment, the Blue Planet, and most recently, the Tyler Prize 2020, which is considered by many as the Nobel laureate in this field.
The Natural Capital Project pioneers science, technology, and partnerships that enable nature and people to thrive. Centered at Stanford University, NatCap drives innovation across disciplines, engaging with experts across all the 7 schools here and around the world. In our work, natural capital refers to Earth's lands, waters, and their biodiversity, basically the machinery of nature that keeps this planet habitable and provides all the basic ingredients of human well-being, makes our lives possible and fulfilling.
Most people focus on climate change, but climate change is only the tip of the iceberg. We're destroying the diversity of life on Earth, we're changing biogeochemical cycles, we're putting plastic into the oceans, on and on and on.
So the Natural Capital Project is really a unique organization of being able to bridge both. The key thing here is science and practice. So if you just wanted to do things in terms of science, academia is well placed to do that. If you just want to do things in terms of practice, there are many organizations like TNC and WWF that have on-the-ground actions and practitioners. But it's this bridging, being able to take the best science and then being able to take this out and communicate it to communities so that we get changes in actions so that ultimately we do things which are best for nature and people.
The first question natural capital science needs to address to inform leaders in driving open these new pathways for green, inclusive growth is where to invest, how much and where should we protect, what elements of nature are crucial to bring into the future with us, and what elements really need restoration in order to bolster the suite of benefits that humanity relies on for health, for water security, for climate security, for food security, and everything else. The second key question is, what sorts of policy and finance mechanisms will incentivize that investment, enable investment in forest restoration or wetland restoration and protection, same on mangroves, coral reefs, in ocean systems. We all know that we've driven natural capital to an all-time low, just at a time when human numbers and our aspirations and impacts are at an all-time high. So it's clear we need to restore natural capital. It's clear we need to be really smart and efficient about it, targeting investments in the people and places and in the types of new economic systems that will open this pathway for green and inclusive types of growth.
So right now, I think that the ways that governments and investors and businesses make decisions doesn't capture the connection between nature and people, and NatCap's work makes what's previously been invisible visible to those decision makers in new ways.
We're going to achieve the future that we're all hoping for, a world in which nature and people thrive, a world in which, in an inclusive way, we drive open green pathways of development. We absolutely need to know what the assets are, what the basic natural capital assets are that generate all of the well-being upon which we fundamentally depend.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gretchen Daily, for that introductory piece on the science that goes with the natural capital accounting. Thank you also for the members of your team from whom we hope we can have also individual presentations in the future. We welcome you back to our Climate Action and Sustainability for Us, or CAS for You. And we now will have the second presentation from Stanford University in two parts, featuring Dr. Katie Arkema, one of the lead scientists in the Natural Capital Project of Stanford University. She will describe how the natural capital approach was used in the Bahamas to engage stakeholders, build scenarios, and achieve project objectives. Let me introduce her briefly. Dr. Katie Arkema is a specialist in natural capital and the development and use of science about how nature benefits people. Her main advocacies cover informing national development planning, climate adaptation, and investments in restoration and conservation, understanding of the ability of coastal ecosystems to protect vulnerable communities from sea level rise and storms, while providing other services, for example, nursery habitat for fisheries and tourism opportunities. She obtained her PhD in ecology, evolution, and marine biology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and she obtained her BA in ecology, minor in Latin American studies from Princeton University. In her work, she has covered the United States, Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa. She has received the Fulbright Nexus Scholarship. Friends, Dr. Katie Arkema of the Natural Capital Project of Stanford University is first of the two presentations that she will make for this first episode.
I'm Katie Arkema, and I'm a lead scientist with the Natural Capital Project. I'm going to walk you through the natural capital process using a case study from our work in the Bahamas. The first step is build the foundation. This is where we agree on project objectives and build a roadmap. After a successful period of working in Belize, the government of the Bahamas became aware of our work and invited us, along with the Inter-American Development Bank, to help them solve a similar problem in their country. The government of the Bahamas was designing a development plan called Vision 2040, where the whole country was engaged in envisioning what they wanted the future of the country to look like. The first island that was had a master plan being designed was Andros Island. Andros is one of the most pristine islands with a wealth of natural resources, one of the largest coral reefs in the Western Hemisphere, large stretches of mangroves. The island is dotted with blue holes that help to provide fresh water. But the people of Andros are in need of investments in infrastructure in order to allow them to better access this wealth of natural resources to support livelihoods. One of the main things we wanted to understand during this step in the process was what was our objective. Our objective was to understand what kinds of infrastructure needs the people of Andros had, and where could those infrastructure needs be targeted and investments be targeted so as not to jeopardize the health of the coastal ecosystems that underline some of the things that the people of Andros care about most. An important part of this step is identifying and engaging key stakeholders. For example, bone fishing guides, tourism operators, and local entrepreneurs. Next, we leverage resources and compile data. During this step, we take stock of what we have and what we need in order to achieve our objectives. In order to be able to map and understand where different coastal activities are taking place, we needed to reach out to government agencies across various sectors in order to collect a wide variety of data. And these ranged from visitation data from the Ministry of Tourism, for example, to information from the Ministry of Works about where different seawalls were and different roads were and their condition, to information from satellite imagery, for example, that indicates where dredging activities were taking place, or from social media-based data that would tell us more about where visitors were going on a finer scale. Incorporating local knowledge and engaging community members is also a really important part of this step, and that's because we just simply don't have quantitative data about all of the things that we wanted to incorporate into this analysis. And so we could reach out to community members and we could incorporate that local knowledge into our larger database by then digitizing those hand-drawn maps. The next step is to ask questions and explore options. One of the really important parts of the science policy approach that we use in INVEST is to make sure that we articulate research questions that answer the key management questions. So this is the phase where we go back and forth between scientists, policies, and policymakers and stakeholders in order to really articulate and ask the most relevant questions. Sometimes at NatCap, we use an optimization approach or a prioritization approach to articulate these questions. In the Bahamas case, we used a scenario-based approach. And the goal of this project was to really understand, well, what would be the best development options for the future of Andros? We developed 4 different scenarios. The first was a conservation-oriented scenario that reflected the interests of community members that wanted to invest in the protection of natural areas. The second scenario was the intensive development scenario, and that reflected the interests of developers, of cruise ship operators, of people that wanted to see sort of massive resorts and golf courses on Andros. The third scenario was the sustainable prosperity scenario, and this scenario combined both conservation elements and development elements, but with a specific eye to strategic investments that would allow for reduction in risk to ecosystems that help to support local livelihoods and economies. And the fourth scenario was a business as usual scenario in which we maintained all the existing levels of investment in infrastructure and nature, but did allow for climate scenarios. One of the really important parts of the ask questions step is that the scenarios reflect the interest of community members. We extracted the elements from a participatory process involving more than 300 people and 200 maps. A second really important part of this step is that it involves iteration of the scenarios. In this process, we started with more like 10 scenarios in the beginning, and through the engagement with community members and with partners, whittled it down to the 4 scenarios that I described here. The next step is analyze and synthesize. This is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of the ecosystem service analysis. It's where we dig into the data to understand how policies, management decisions, and investments can change ecosystems and change the livelihoods of the people that depend upon them. INVEST can be used here to help us analyze trade-offs from different decisions. It acts almost like a what-if machine where we can say, if we do this, what will it look like in the future? In the Bahamas, we asked, what would happen if these different development scenarios were enacted? For example, under the sustainable prosperity scenario, safeguarding coral reefs and mangrove forests and seagrass beds enhanced the returns from the lobster fishery from 14 to 20 million over the 25-year period, in contrast to an intensive development scenario where those ecosystems were degraded and led to a loss in production of 10 million over that same period. Sometimes during the course of a science policy process, events happen that can change the course of our work in a particular region. In the case of the Bahamas, during our 2 years of engagement there, the country was hit by 2 major hurricanes, Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Joaquin. These events helped to shine a light on the importance of developing new and innovative coastal resilience strategies. And so following these hurricanes, one of the questions that we heard most prominently from our partners was what areas are most at risk from coastal hazards and where can some of the natural and green infrastructure be used to help to reduce that risk? Present results and inform decisions is next. As I've mentioned before, it's important to keep community members and partners engaged throughout the process. And it is in this step where we together present the culmination of that engagement. This is often done through interactive workshops, the design of online interfaces that can help to build capacity, and through consensus building exercises. One of the most important parts of this step is to really think about and remind yourself who the audience is, what the questions were that they were initially asking, and to present the results in a way that's accessible. It's also really important to identify and circle back to who the beneficiaries are in this step. In the Bahamas, there were 3 clear outcomes from our work there. The first is that we were able to influence the conversation around the importance of coastal ecosystems for reducing risk from coastal hazards. A key part of influencing that conversation was not only through discussions and workshops and engagement, but also by making the results of our analysis accessible to community members and to partners in government agencies through the development of an online viewer. The second outcome was that we were able to use the results of our analysis to help inform the design of the master plan for Andros Island. The Office of the Prime Minister of the Bahamas used the analysis to inform that plan, and then stakeholders and community members have been able to use that plan to help inform discussions of development proposals. International developers will come to the island and propose cruise ship development or aragonite mining. And with that plan in hand, community members can communicate what they have chosen for their future. The third outcome is that our analysis was used to influence a very specific decision around an investment in green infrastructure. And this was through a loan from the Inter-American Development Bank to the government of the Bahamas for coastal management. On Andros, the loan is specifically designated towards piloting new green infrastructure approaches. The next step is to evaluate and iterate. Throughout the process, we're always checking back in to make sure that we're aiming toward meeting our objectives. And a big part of the evaluation and iteration is continuing to elicit feedback from our partners and from community members. We can also, throughout the process, leverage events that may occur to help inform our analysis and inform our work. As I mentioned before, Hurricanes Matthew and Joaquin helped to change the course of the questions that we were asking in the region. They also helped us validate our results. We were able to see that those same areas that our models predicted might be impacted by storms and coastal hazards were affected in quite a severe way from the impact of Hurricane Matthew and Joaquin. Not only do we evaluate and iterate on a project level, but we are also using each project to continually fine-tune the process itself. With the Andros Plan, we are able to show the multiple benefits of ecosystems for development, for livelihoods, and for long-term sustainability.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katie Arkema, for that first part of your presentation in this first episode of our program, Climate Action and Sustainability for Us, or CAS for You. Okay, so I will not introduce her again, but I will introduce her topic, which is on scaling the NatCap approach in the Caribbean. Building on NatCap's engagements in Belize and the Bahamas, Stanford's NatCap project lead scientist, Dr. Katie Arkema, will talk about how the work is being scaled up across the Mesoamerican Reef region and the Caribbean. Dr. Katie Arkema.
The natural capital approach is scalable. Our work in the Bahamas builds on what we did in Belize, and now we're increasing this portfolio across the Mesoamerican Reef and the Caribbean region as a whole. We're working on 2 different key projects, one with the Inter-American Development Bank and one with the World Wildlife Fund, funded and supported by the International Climate Initiative. In both projects, we're working to ensure that climate considerations and the most advanced data technology can be used to help us understand where ecosystems are at risk and where vulnerable communities may be affected by that degradation of ecosystems. We're then using this information to inform new and innovative climate adaptation strategies, to do a better job with adaptive management of our coastal zone, and to ensure that we're monitoring and evaluating green infrastructure projects effectively. Our work in the Bahamas with the IDB illustrates the interest that multilaterals have in these kinds of projects and the potential for working with multilaterals across the world. Multilaterals are interested in the kinds of approaches and tools we use at NatCap because it makes sense financially as well as ecologically. Multilaterals in the IDB in particular can make decisions that support people and nature if they can be involved in the bigger picture planning process. It's a lot easier when you're working upstream rather than just project by project. Our growing projects in the Mesoamerican Reef are just one example of how the natural capital approach is scalable, ultimately creating a future in which nature and people can thrive.
Thank you very much, Dr. Katie Arkema, for your clear presentations of those two cases. I'm sure that few of us have been to those countries that you mentioned, but we can relate enough to them because we have similar coastal characteristics. We now welcome you back for the last presentation in our first episode of this program on valuing nature in real-world decisions. Dr. Gretchen Daily, the co-founder of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford, will now describe how this powerful approach to valuing nature is applied on policy and finance using new forms of science, data, software, and engagement. Again, this approach was developed by the Natural Capital Project at Stanford together with many partners. It is now being deployed by governments, businesses, and communities, driving change globally. China and Latin America stand out for innovation at scale, illuminating pathways toward green, inclusive development. I hope that in the future we'll be able to invite representatives from China and Latin America to share with us their experiences in applying the natural capital process and system that Stanford University has developed with its partners. Dr. Daly first presented this approach at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's 17th Annual Memorial Lecture honoring Professor Henry W. Kendall, the 1990 Nobel Prize awardee for his research that provided the first experimental evidence for quarks. Dr. Gretchen Daily on valuing nature in real-world decisions.
Have you come here? And so I'm going to start off on a tough note, as to all that we face, but then what I want to do is get into some really promising looking pathways. Ever holding on to hope that we can drive the change that we need to open, a better future, to secure, people and nature. So living in California, it's just unreal. I can't tell you, even being relatively far from most of these fires, it's unreal living there and having this kind of a tragedy unfold. And I know it's the case all across in different forms. North America, here, Houston, and then obviously across the world. We all work very internationally. I work a lot in China now. And it's just staggering to see the extremes that are opening up in human experience. And to ask ourselves, well, what can we do, at this point? What should we try to do, and what are the most maybe strategic pathways for making an impact? So that's what I'd like to get into. And I've taken a point of entry, relating to valuing nature. And you'll see what I mean by that. It's partly sort of putting a price tag on. So rather than an all-you-can-eat buffet, we have a sense of scarcity and that we need some table manners, and we need to be investing in, I'm just seeing some good friends here, investing in our life support systems, as opposed to looking at them as, a sort of one-time exhaustible sort of set of resources. And I'm going to start with Costa Rica, one of my favorite countries where I've been lucky to work since 1991. Here's a shot of me back then as a grad student. And the question of the day was, could biodiversity exist outside of native habitat, especially tropical biodiversity that had evolved in moist, darker tropical forests? Could it really survive and thrive out in the much drier, open, exposed to sunlight agricultural areas? So I bring this up because it meant going around to a lot of different farms and asking to work on those farms to see whether, given that agriculture and our food production activities are in many ways the biggest driver of biodiversity loss up to now, whether we could confront that by integrating nature more cleverly into agricultural practices. So working on a lot of people's lands, they all said, sure, come on, let me show you everything I got. And they'd give me their kids to help monitor and guard our little traps, in this case for butterflies, putting little numbers on the butterflies to see how they traveled around the landscape, using this kind of delicious rotting banana bait that was spiked with molasses and rum. Would bring these butterflies in from all over. And the thing I kept coming up against, though, as a grad student back then, was how, just to mention one angle, these kids all ate the butterfly bait, and it was sweet at one level. At another level, the bait turned bad after a few hours, and it's that the kids didn't have enough to eat. And I kept feeling very uncomfortable pursuing these studies and wondering, well, how could we really harmonize the need to grow more food and to have livelihoods, whether it's in food production or coffee or other things, with conservation. And about that time, this amazing scientist, Alvaro Manya, you might have heard of him, he shared in the Nobel Peace Prize. He's a hydrologist and an economist, got his degrees at Stanford. So I happened to get to know him, and then he set up the first Ministry of Environment and Energy in Costa Rica, and he set up the first national payment for ecosystem services scheme, where you're basically saying, okay, ecosystems are a capital asset, just like other types of capital, physical capital, like here we have in our universities or homes, human capital as we cultivate here our knowledge and skills as well as our health. Other types of capital we can think about that ecosystems also provide a stream of benefits. And he set up a program that's been, by all accounts, it's been subject to a lot of scrutiny and things, but over all these years, it's been operating for over 20 years now, that paid people for this particular set of services. And he got European countries to buy in to the first carbon offsets for climate stability. He got the national hydropower company, the electricity company basically. Most of Costa Rica's electricity is generated through hydropower, to pay in for the role of forests in regulating water flow and maintaining the lifetime of hydropower facilities, holding back sediment and stuff like that. Biodiversity benefits, he got Merck Pharmaceuticals to pay in. It was just sort of a nominal amount, but raised awareness of the fact that the majority of our modern day pharmaceuticals, something like 120 of the top 150, trace their origin to plants, mostly tropical plants. And then scenic beauty, with all there is, often the biggest sector in Costa Rica is tourism. So these payments, it might look like very little, but this amount would be a lot actually in the United States, even to shift practices on land. And they are credited together with other policy changes. It's always hard to disentangle the exact impact of any particular change in a rapidly changing and complex world, but credited with having helped turn around a situation where Costa Rica had the highest deforestation rate in the world ever recorded to now having, net reforestation. So with that sort of story in mind, what I'd like to do is go through an arc of thinking about what understanding we need that we can generate in universities through research, and then what connection we need with people out on the land and in policy arenas and financial investment arenas and such to bring about that kind of a transformation where we're driving economic dimensions of growth that are important, but at the same time dramatically reducing our impact on the life support systems we depend on utterly. So securing human well-being at the same time as securing the environment over the long run. So all this has led to Costa Rica remaining a pioneer. We're continuing to work there. The new president, I don't know how many of you know of him, I think he's the youngest on earth. He got elected at the age of 38, and now he's a ripe old 39. And he's supporting a lot of investment in decarbonizing the economy by 2050 is the goal, in a race to be the first or among the first nations to do so, and in designing many other types of investments in nature and restoring even much more forest, for example, than they have so far. So to tell a story, I'm going to back off a little bit and give a bit of the history, going back to yet another Nobel laureate, Ken Arrow, who was based at Stanford University, passed away just a couple years ago, but played a founding role and a really vital role in legitimizing and developing a new field kind of at the interface of environment, or certainly ecology and economics, and kind of incorporating many other disciplines into the effort as time went on. And just showing how nature can be seen as a type of asset, and justifying investments in nature even within our current economic system. Shortly after that arena started opening up, there were many pioneering cases actually coming along, the one in Costa Rica being just one example. Another with which you're probably all familiar here in New York was a decision when water quality started dipping below minimum EPA standards to invest not in a water filtration plant like they had for the Croton watershed, where about 10% of the water supply for New York originates, but instead to invest up in the Catskills, Delaware, watershed where 90% of the water originates at a much lower cost. So that was sort of their choice, investing in physical capital or in natural capital to achieve water security for the 9 or 10 million people drinking water in New York City. And it was estimated, to be a lot less expensive at $1 to $1.5 billion going into the watershed and changing the way people like David Hawley, the guy standing on the left, is managing his dairy farm using that solar heated tent in place of the beautiful but otherwise not very healthy New England barns, the traditional barns, but dank and dark inside, where cattle are often getting, or dairy cows often getting different types of illness that get passed right on to people. So with that stark difference, investing in the operations of farmers and foresters and sort of towns up in the Catskills versus paying $6 to $8 billion to build a filtration plant, the decision was clear. It wasn't without a battle that I'm sure you know about, but it was a pretty stark choice back then, and the decision has been maintained. New York City is still reliant on filtering its water naturally through the roots and soils of the Catskills mountain range rather than through any built filtration system. So in a way, it's a triple win, right? The people in the city so far are getting clean drinking water at the lowest possible cost. People up in the source area are getting paid for benefits that they've supplied throughout the history of the city but never really been recognized for. And then if you care about anything else, would you rather have a romantic weekend away at a filtration plant or up in the beautiful Catskills? You can think of the many other benefits that were not really quantified in this analysis and yet that are being supported by the decision. So how do we extend that? How do we systematize and build a universal approach to take these cases and replicate them all over the world? Supposedly about, a kind of back of the envelope analysis shows that at least a quarter of the world's major cities would have an economic justification in investing in upper watersheds to secure water supply rather than building filtration plants. What's limiting us in replicating and scaling that New York City model? How do we extend Costa Rica's model across other countries and drive open this pathway to green growth or green development that would have multiple wins? That's the big challenge before us. So about this time, a large group formed the Natural Capital Project. It's basically a partnership into which everyone is welcome. There are about 50 research institutions, about 200 plus implementing institutions around the world. And the idea is to build up these approaches, demonstrate them, and scale them. So just a tiny bit of background to dive into a few stories on both the research and on how it's going in terms of scaling and real impact. So, what is natural capital? We're just talking about Earth's lands, waters, and variety of life, or biodiversity, which you would have read about in the papers today, is being driven to extinction at an all-time record rate. And then, so what is the value of natural capital? That's a tough question. And we've often thought about the, not wanting to be offensive or worse, just completely lacking in meaning and trying to slap a price tag on nature when we know that at one level it's sort of infinitely valuable. We're all part of nature. If we think about our lives and how brief they are on this planet and what we're all connected to, we could get into realms that are kind of being left behind in the way cultures are evolving today, and yet are really important for thinking about what matters, and that thought that nature is infinitely valuable and we shouldn't be, from a moral perspective, just driving everything to extinction as the dominant species on the planet. Yet in decisions, mostly nature comes in at a zero if it's not something to be extracted or mined, and in which case it's not living anyway. So neither of those extremes has helped, inform decisions in a productive way. And the idea here is to develop lower bound values that are meaningful and change decisions. So obviously we can think about being on a sterile planet or like the moon and recognize that, in fact, we're totally dependent, always have been and always will be, on the different life support processes of the biosphere, that thin layer of life about Earth, for our atmosphere, for soils and all their fertility, for a hydrologic cycle, for basically everything that underpins our food security, water security, climate and energy security, health, and so on. But how do we reconcile with the rapid rate of depletion that Henry was so concerned with? And how do we operate, given that now, humanity is a global force more than ever before, demanding more and more of nature, making it more and more scarce? How do we capture the value in our decisions before it's too late? So there wasn't much on this in the early days. What we've developed as a community over the past 20 years, basically, is an approach that is oriented around informing decisions, like I said, and looking at how alternative decisions, our different choices, building a filtration plant or investing in the upper watershed to restore the functioning of nature, how they affect ecosystems, how that it would affect the delivery of services or benefits to people, improving well-being, and then how we can transmit that understanding through our institutions to change decisions. That's kind of the framing. And I'll just dive into some stories more on the right there, asking a couple of basic questions, and then showing how we can take this understanding and really drive change in policy, in finance, and in management. So heading over here, I'm going to first dive into this question of, what good is biodiversity? Basically, if you're a farmer, we're all consumers of what farmers produce, so we ought to care as well. But if you're out in the countryside, how do you harmonize? How do you make it so those girls eating the bait for the butterfly traps can live a decent life and sustain or restore tropical forest? And how much hope is there even for sustaining biodiversity in deforested parts of the countryside? What we've found over about 30 years now of many doctoral dissertations and many different approaches to the research is that a lot can be sustained, not everything, but a significant amount. Well, I'll show you more specifically in a second, of native tropical biodiversity in farming habitats if we conduct our farming in a wildlife-friendly way, like this royal flycatcher getting pretty upset at being caught in a net, but he's about to be let go. There's his mate, even more upset at the whole thing. Here's a bat, the biggest bat, spectrals bat found in the Americas, and it's the largest carnivorous bat, goes around eating those birds. And here we are in a coffee plantation. That's a coffee shrub over the shoulder of Jason there. So all kinds of stuff, the silky anteater. If you go around and do any level of looking, this is a really bright, hopeful finding. And over the many years of these different dissertations, what I'm going to show here is just one little summary set of statistics. The fraction found in forest only, it's high for plants. You see most plants are found in forest only in the dark green part of the bar. But with just about everything else, if you have enough forest in a landscape, it seems that at least over the decadal time scale, it's hard to say over the long, long run, you can sustain surprisingly high levels, abundances and diversities of these different groups of organisms. So that's the proportion of native species to Costa Rica and all those different groups. So that's really hopeful. But so let's say you're a farmer, and that means you do have a potential role to play, but why would you, adjust your farming in order to sustain biodiversity? What benefits might there be for you? Are there any at all, or would you just be providing a public service for society? And here's one way into the problem. It's just to think about, well, what do all these organisms do? And what do we depend on? One case is pollination. A huge fraction of our crops, about a third of our food supply comes from pollinated species or types of crops. And it's the most nutritious stuff. It's the fruits, vegetables, nuts, and things like that. And that shows you, this is part of the country where a lot of coffee is grown. I think we're all probably even more dependent on coffee these days at MIT and Stanford than fruits, nuts, and veggies. But anyway, it's pollinated. But actually, guess how many, weeks of the year coffee is blooming? And think about it from the point of view of a bee pollinator that needs nectar and pollen every day. Can a pollinator survive in a coffee plantation? There's basically no way. Does anybody want to guess how many days of the year coffee is blooming, providing nectar and pollen? It's something like 5 days a year. And it's a spectacular 5 days. It looks like the whole landscape has erupted in sort of popcorn. But in that brief time, bees come out from nearby forest where you've got a huge variety of plants that are blooming in all the different weeks of the year and supporting what bees need. So we can ask that question, does the nearby forest benefit coffee farmers? And, can we measure those benefits? So I'm going to show you just really briefly how this sort of work is done. Across a landscape, you try to find places that, in this case, are near and far from forest, where coffee is being grown and where you're controlling for the many other factors that could vary across a distance gradient like that. And you want to isolate the effect of distance from forest on the bee community and the activities of the bees. And what we found is the closer you are, say, to forest, the more diverse were the bees, the more pollination you had. So you're there counting the little tiny pollen grains that are transferred between flowers. And you actually got 20% higher yields and 50% higher quality. And this is in coffee, a plant that's now, self-pollinating, but there's still a huge benefit to cross-fertilization. So for this one farm, that amounted to a little over $60,000 per year additional income, and that's massive. All the difference between being bankrupt and being solvent and profitable as a farmer. So you could ask this same question about other types of services. In the case of the bees, here's another question for you just to have your mind going. Guess how many types of bee are out there performing pollination in coffee? Is it 10 or 20 or anybody want to throw out a number? 30. It's a staggering, what were you going to guess? 3. Okay, it was about 700. I mean, so I'm just brushing past things here, but we nearly went blind and crippled, hunched over microscopes with the glorious day outside while we determined the identity of all these bees. You can tell them apart looking at things like whether the hairs split on their backs and stuff like that. They can tell each other apart easily, but this is tricky business. So yeah, that study took a while to do, a couple of years. It takes 9 months even for the coffee to mature after being fertilized. So with similar undertakings, we then went to look at pest control. So here, this was all led by Taylor Ricketts, who's a professor at Vermont now. And then a student of mine named Danny Karp decided to tackle this problem of pest control. So there's this terrible pest on coffee, the coffee berry borer, this little tiny 3 millimeter long beetle that bores in and sets up shop and eats up the bean that we would otherwise be enjoying. And so to run a pest control experiment, you go out all over the countryside setting up these exclosures that prevent say, in our case, we were looking at birds and bats. And how effective are they at preventing the pests from devouring the crop? And so you can see up there in the upper left, we had they're all at different distances from forest, so these are all close to that patch of forest. In some, we let the birds in, but not the bats in. In others, we let bats in to feed on whatever they could, but not the birds. In others, we excluded both, and finally, we had a control that let both types of organism in. And this meant having a bunch of people zooming around the countryside in the dark, early in the morning, to raise, and then in the evening, raise and lower these nets appropriately so that the right treatment is going on for months at a time, and then comparing yield and degree of infestation. So another major undertaking. And we found in the end that birds contributed to reducing infestation if you were near forest by about 50%, which also translated differently on different farms, but into a massive economic boost. By contrast, we found that bats were really complicated. Sometimes they ate up the berry borer, other times they were eating other things. And it just is a reminder of all the mystery in life and how blunt our approaches are right now to trying to value it. And a reminder of how humble we need to be and thinking about the many intimate connections between people and nature. But that study involved about 250 bird species and about 70 bat species that live in around these coffee farms. So there have been tons of these studies. And the question now over the past decade or so is, how do you go from studies like this to policy and finance? How do you really make a difference? Before I answer or try to answer that question, I'm going to dive into another realm of research just to give you another taste of what's going on in this broad agenda. And that is to think about where we live today and how we've basically entered the urban century, and humanity is becoming more and more an urban species. So taking away from the beauty of the tropics and out in the farming countryside, and now thinking about the world's massive cities that more and more of us live in, and about the mental health issues. There are a lot of issues living in cities, and one that's not gotten very much attention and yet is more and more on the radar is mental health. So city living, is involved with it, or associated with a 20% increase in anxiety-related disorders, a 40% increase in mood, mostly depressive-related disorders compared to people living in countryside situations. And this made headlines a few years ago with a paper that came out in Nature by a German group in Mannheim, Heidelberg, looking at how, different the behavior of the mind in responding to stress is among people who either grew up in different situations in more countryside versus huge cities, looking at the amygdala that really gets set back in the early ages of child development, or you can also tell kind of where people live today with parts of the brain that remain plastic as we go through life and adjust to different surroundings. So a student of mine working together with a bunch of people in psychology, I'm just going to give you a taste of one of many experiments underway, decided to look at this. I was afraid he was going to be with me. I liked him a lot, but for 100 years, because it seems so complicated to work out the impact of, say, nature experience on mental health. But he decided, if you've been to Stanford, to get people to come into the psychology department, take a bunch of tests. So here's sort of the protocol. Take some tests. They're all urban people. They've all arrived in kind of a bit of a panic under stress because there's never any parking. And it's hard to find the building. Then they had to go into this lab, take these tests. Everybody was equally stressed out at the beginning. And then they were randomly assigned to take this shuttle bus and drive 10 minutes or like 8 minutes, either to El Camino, if you guys know the place, and take a 50-minute walk, 50-minute walk along El Camino. It's not a terrible street, when you think about the world's massive cities, but it's a big urban street. Or take this nicer walk 8 minutes away in the other direction around kind of under some oak trees and stuff. And it was incredible to see what a difference came of the two groups. So there were different tests. There are many tests, as you guys know, developed in psychology and played with for many decades now. So they're well understood. So here's one type of test, just answering these little math questions. You've got to answer them quickly, get them right, and then memorize the number that's flashed at you between the math problems. So true or false? Letter. Remember that letter. True or false? Remember the letter. True or false? Got to wake up. Remember the letter. True or false? Remember the letter. And this can go on and on. And the question was, okay, would the groups be different? They're basically the same at the beginning, no statistical difference. And look after. This is the difference in the number of letters remembered after they've taken the walk as compared to before. And you see, at least we didn't make life way worse for the urban people. They did a lousy job before, and they still did a lousy job after their walk. But the nature people went popping up and could remember about 11 more letters than those who had that urban walk. So it's just pretty eye-opening things like this Another type of test involved just asking people how they felt. And it's in the realm of rumination, something we all do, this sort of repetitive negative thoughts about oneself, like saying, dang it, why did I, kicking yourself, for making some silly decision or doing something you regret months, even years later. And that's what you look like when you're doing it. And here too, people came in, everybody the same at the beginning, but after the walk, the people that walked in nature, when asking to respond to these types of questions and say how they felt, I spend a great deal of time thinking back over my embarrassing or disappointing moments. The nature walkers just kind of let go of it all. The urban walkers were still ruminating, at least a pretty dramatic difference there. And a final type of test that we engaged in involved brain scanning before and after the walk to look at which parts of the brain really get activated. And interestingly, relating this to rumination and to the risk of onset of depression, there's one part of the brain in particular, the subgenual prefrontal cortex, that gets activated. Its activation is a risk factor, basically, in depression. And what we found was that, again, luckily we didn't hurt anybody walking on that El Camino, but the nature people had a much lower level of activation of that part of the brain after just a 50-minute walk. So all of this taken together, there were many other tests done, showed as a result of, it seemed, of nature experience, an increase in working memory and in mood and improvement, a reduction of anxiety and tendency to ruminate. And there have been a lot of studies, not thousands really as in the other case, but maybe hundreds over the past decade. We have a new article coming out actually soon. If you happen to be interested, feel free to email me and I can send you a copy, hopefully soon, of the proof. Kind of reviewing this and showing how we would make a model that actually allowed you to predict the impacts of some aspects, some types of nature experience, as complex as they are, on cognitive functioning and emotional well-being, a big subject among educators today when you look at how many schools are situated in places with basically no green space around them, and how many workplaces as well. So how do you go, though, from these initial studies to making a meaningful impact? And that's what I want to dive into now. And this is where everybody's more than welcome to jump in. So the idea in systematizing a universal approach is to start developing a common language and basically a suite of models that are based on evidence, obviously, on good science. And in many realms, we have enough evidence. I'd say this is just an emerging realm, and it's sort of in a light gray color. But in many realms, we know a lot about the role of elements of nature, whether it's wetlands or big forests or just small individual trees and things, contributing to coastal protection, to cooling cities that otherwise heat up something, like 7 degrees Celsius more than surrounding areas and cities, or to food production via pollination, pest control, and other benefits, flood control provided by wetlands, upland forests, and so on. So there are many, many benefits where we can account for the role of nature in helping to deliver or secure the supply. And we're developing models of all of these and integrating them into an open source, free sort of data and modeling software platform. And this has now, we've been developing it for about 7 years or so, and the models have been taken up to some degree in most countries. So people, at least grad students, are playing around with them in a lot of countries. And at the other extreme, in some places, they're being used to drive massive changes in policy and finance, and that's what I'll showcase now. And we could then be thinking together about how to improve the science and bolster all this side of it, but also how we can really mainstream and scale up the efforts that we see underway. So we've been working as a partnership all over the world, and we have two main kind of decision contexts. One is in development planning by governments, by development banks that invest, hundreds of billions to trillions of dollars in infrastructure and other development plans. A new area for us is in sustainable, livable cities and developing the software. We have about 8 models now in sort of a beta testing phase, accounting for the role of nature in cities. And then these kind of underpin it all. Coastal climate resilience, whether in cities or across countries, securing fresh water like New York City did, and then we're working a bit in the private sector, not so much, and we can talk about why later. We're just getting way less traction there than with more public-oriented institutions. I'm going to give you examples from Latin America and China. So in Latin America, the example I'll give involves basically replicating what happened in New York and cities waking up to scarcity, as we saw in Sao Paulo or in Cape Town recently, and actually in many less talked about but equally severe crises with the growth of cities and with climate impacts and with just inadequate infrastructure. Water security is just a dramatic problem in many, many places. And water often comes from kind of a world apart from urban residents and other downstream users. So here in the Andes, a Quechua-speaking person, hundreds of kilometers away from industry, from urban residents, from big agricultural businesses and cooperatives or hydropower producers downstream. And yet they're intimately connected. And how can we, through institutional change, drive investments that yield that win-win-win type of situation that we want, the green growth type of pathway. So the software that we've developed is oriented around addressing the questions that water utilities or other water users downstream would have, such as, well, which activities should we invest in up in these faraway watersheds to achieve greater water security? Should it be, protecting forest like here, or replanting forest in areas that have been deforested, or just fencing livestock away from open streams and rivers would have a major benefit? Where do you do what? And then, given how vast these watersheds are, you can imagine across the whole spine of the Andes and feeding cities down in the valley areas below. Where do you make your investment, and how do you inform your decisions so you're being at least slightly strategic? So the software will identify with a simple digital elevation model, the watersheds, let you delimit watersheds. And these are all these watersheds feeding cities in the Cauca Valley of Colombia, where a lot of the innovation first occurred, bringing the New York model to South America. And let's just take this city up here. Now, here's that city, and here's its watershed on the side. This is the uplands. And you can see the software lets you, it's just a simple set of models letting you determine what portfolio of investments would achieve a given improvement in water quality. So protecting forest up at the top near the ridgeline right up here, reforesting in some key places that have been badly deforested and where there's a lot of potential runoff from farms, adding forests to some pastures, fencing, and adding a lot of understory vegetation, enriching areas where there's a lot of livestock near open waterways. So you map out a lot of social and other data layers, the cost of land and land transitions and things like that, and get your portfolio of investments that tell you then what improvement in water quality you might expect under different budget levels, different interventions on the part of the water utility, say. And so these actually have sprung up now in more than 40 cities, including most of the capital cities in Latin America. And at one level, it's very exciting and promising to see that in a matter of 10 years, there's been widespread uptake. At another level, they seem to sort of be stalling out. There were just 15 more added in Colombia, so I don't know. It's hard to say if we're just on the, which part of the curve we're on here, but there is a worry for anybody in political science or governance or other dimensions that, you know, the initial wave has kind of crested, and how can we keep spreading this? What are the barriers, and how can we lift them to advancing this approach elsewhere? But so far, the monitoring shows a real payoff, even though you expect some of the impacts to take years to manifest themselves. Monitoring so far shows a payoff on both the social and the biophysical goals. So that's what's happening there. It's all spreading into Africa a bit, where we're working in Kenya, around Nairobi, and across parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, and certainly in China. And now I'll turn to China and give you the last and perhaps most interesting case in many dimensions. So everybody's aware, I'm sure, of the environmental devastation in China. Looking back over the last century, in particular, with the incredibly rapid, you know, just historic economic growth and alleviation of poverty, has come just extreme levels of crisis in terms of flooding, air and water quality, and loss of biodiversity, decline even of the most, you know, iconic species like the panda. And the president now, Xi Jinping, is advancing a vision of developing an ecological civilization for the 21st century. And his slogan gets translated different ways, but clear waters and lush mountains are gold and silver. We will not trade them for gold or silver is one of the ways of putting this vision out. And, you know, how could China possibly turn around? You might be wondering and skeptical of advances really being made toward this dream. But it's incredible to see how pragmatic and how determined the leaders are in making this change for many national security reasons, as well as kind of less maybe critical types of reasons. But asking very specifically, well, okay, how much, you know, where and how much should we protect? Tell us and we'll go at it. How can we secure nature and human livelihoods at the same time? You know, what are the options in different areas, particularly ecologically sensitive regions of the country? And finally, how can we move beyond performance metrics like gross domestic product to inform whether policies are really helping us or actually just hiding all the damages like GDP does? So getting into this a little bit, China's gone further than any other country in setting up a system of natural capital accounts and developing with data that get better and better almost month by month, showing exactly where all types of food are produced. And China produces, I think, more types of food, especially vegetables, than any other place. Showing, you know, exactly where the carbon is sequestered, or exactly which ecosystems are crucial for reducing sand and dust storm risk, or also crucial for, you know, augmenting that risk if they're not well managed, mostly arid areas where there's production of cashmere and other, you know, goat grazing and things like that. This is 10 to the 12th tons. There we're looking at, I don't know why I have per capita. It's the, for some reason we've weighted it by the number of people involved there, and I don't remember why here exactly, and I think I might have swapped in the graphs will look the same either way. What we wanted to note was how important these different services are, and we were not asked to monetize the production of this service, but instead to indicate how many people are affected by sand and dust storms and how many people could benefit from investing in improved grazing and other land management practices in the areas where the sand and dust originate, and that's where the weighting by population came in. And thanks for raising that. It doesn't, it's not a factor as I'm presenting it right here, but it comes into the valuation when you then ask, where should we invest? This, here again, I think it's, yeah, that's the answer. So I'm sorry, I don't have the raw number of the potential export from the source areas. Here it's multiplied by the number of people downwind in the northeastern cities that experience the pollution, air pollution that results. So I'm happy to show you this. A paper came out in Science in 2016, and we could get into it in depth, and I just have a little mistake here in showing the per capita part. But the idea, same thing here, is with water supply for hydropower and irrigation and supply to cities, which parts of the country are most vital for holding the water. And then finally on the biodiversity front, we've mapped out where biodiversity is located and where new reserves will be going in as the government commits to a major improvement in their biodiversity conservation efforts. So what we found in developing these accounts, first off, is that over a 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, most of the services improved in supply, and that was thanks to major investments through the sloping land conversion program made in restoring ecosystems. And it has led to zoning the country around these different benefits, targeting places where the payoff of an investment would be highest, helping the greatest number of people at sort of the lowest cost. So initially it was zoned at this level. We developed a bunch of demonstrations showing how, for example, Beijing gets over half of its water supply from just north of the city in the Miyun watershed area, how improved agricultural practices in that area would help increase both the quantity and the quality of water going to the city. Another major demonstration using these approaches concerning the south to north water transfer project, this massive transfer of water that's happening from 3 places. This is the Middle Fork, got going a few years ago, and improving water supply down here in the south of Shanxi province. What kinds of investments in improving ecosystems would even make this massive project that has a lot of objections to it feasible and sustainable? And then finally, just the past month, we've published a report on transforming agriculture in this demonstration area, tropical area, that's been heavily deforested, Hainan Island, mostly for rubber production and other crops, how to improve agricultural practices to secure ecosystem services as well as production of the commodity. And I'd be happy to share any of this. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but the idea in this case, this is a one-time sort of thing with 3 source areas, but in this case, the policy is going to extend across the country of investing in transforming agricultural practices, and same with this watershed investment. And so as a result of all this, now the country has zoned about 49% of the land for improving ecosystems, their condition, and supply of services. So in any region, every square meter is assigned a certain land category. There are 4 categories. One's agricultural, one's sort of urban or town, one's sort of industrial, and then there's this natural capital category. And they're all mapped out precisely. And about 200 million people are now being paid to restore ecosystems in those areas that are mapped out for natural capital. And we do also a lot of work to see whether the social goals are being met, interviewing people, often elderly, living in Western, more remote parts of China while their kids are working in factories in more urban or industrial places. And getting to the end here, I just will show one more dimension of this, kind of in the financial side, trying to transform to what is they're calling a green financial system, where downstream or downwind beneficiaries, mostly in cities and in the wealthy coastal provinces, are paying inland areas and populations to change their livelihoods, ideally improving both. Working in these key cities, China's sort of top cities, and Lishui being the place where Xi Jinping makes his main announcements over these environmental policies. And finally, a major guide in all of this is something where we'd love to team up. It's a recent development called for in 2014, a new metric, gross ecosystem product. And the idea is to quantify, just like we do for the economy in calculating gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced by ecosystems. So here, if we think about GDP and then consider GEP, they're kind of parallel systems of accounts where you have sort of your capital, stock, and the suite of goods and services that comes from it. Similarly, in ecosystems, less well known, some overlap that we can account for, and really trying to demonstrate the utility of a metric like this in China. And then there are many development banks actually that want to use something similar in guiding investments in country development. So it involves collecting data from all over, much of it remotely sensed from satellites and things. Also in China, there's about 140,000 ground truthing sites. So there's a very systematic approach to checking what's happening and changing on the ground, analyzing the data, and then running the invest models or new models as we keep building that up to estimate the production and value of services, goods and services that come from ecosystems. And then using this information in three contexts. One is just to recognize explicitly the contribution of ecosystems to the economy and society in a way that's ignored in most places when we think about our finance and policy. Second, to guide financial compensation among regions, such as in the water security for cities arena, but in many others, and thinking about hydropower production like in Costa Rica, thinking about air pollution of sand and dust, and many other contexts. And then finally, evaluating whether these policies and the people meant to implement them are performing over time and adjusting as we go. So that's a major innovation that's being tested now at different levels in China on a sort of provisional demonstration basis. And would love to sort of talk if anybody wants to follow up later on this. Top people from government, the guy heading up the National Development and Reform Commission, Department of Development Planning, a major part of the government, and this guy heading up basically the equivalent of the finance ministry, coming to work out how to develop this sort of system of green finance, and very open to input from experts worldwide. And then coming to the very end here, I just want to mention, I'm sure everybody's read and possibly knows a ton about the Belt and Road Initiative, China's investments across the world in many other countries. They're also investing in trying to help universalize this type of approach among receiving countries that now number way over 100, I think, in Latin America and certainly across the ancient Silk Road and possibly maritime Silk Road. So we've been running these trainings. This was our first, and we have a second one planned that have filled up overnight with literally a sort of 48-hour registration period, and we get to the maximum we can possibly handle. But just bring this up to spark comments or suggestions on how to accelerate when we get back to Henry Kendall and his reflections on how summers are becoming like a long weekend and how we've got to slow and reverse the rate of planetary destruction. And, however imperfect some of these elements of science and understanding are today, we've got to act a lot more quickly than we are at present. How do we accelerate across the world? So there are a lot of development banks adopting these approaches at one level or another. And yeah, the bottom line is we don't have much time. We have a lot of inspiration to look to, though, and a lot of eager, open-minded, and ready to run leaders in scaling institutions with whom we could engage. So I'm excited about engaging a lot further with them and with you at any level. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to following up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gretchen Daily, for that detailed presentation of how the natural capital approach is being applied in making policies and taking financial decision making. I am sure that we shall refer to your piece, to your two presentations, and those of Dr. Katie Arkema as we go along in applying this concept in our country. And this is the purpose, one purpose of this video, so that we can go back and refer to these discussions again and again. And this will be also in our electronic book. Let me now end our first episode with an explanation of what we have done and still have to do. So this is an article that I wrote for the Mapping the Future column of the Management Association of the Philippines in the Philippine Daily Inquirer on June 14. My title was Recovering and Developing with Nature. And I discussed here, among others, the evolution of the natural capital accounting approach starting in 1973 when economist Dr. Schumacher first mentioned it in his work on Small is Beautiful. And after that, Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow put more knowledge and built on the natural capital term with his discussion of this approach in the early 1980s, I think. That's when I think it's about the time when I was taking my PhD, and Professor Ken Arrow was one of my professors. He was my professor in Economics 101. He also mentored Professor Daly, but we're actually decades apart because I'm much older than Professor Daly. Dr. Daly's work has significantly improved the treatment and use of natural capital accounting by adding science, data, all of those things that I mentioned earlier. So we now have the natural capital accounting approach, which is being applied in several countries. In early 2021, the United Nations issued their system on environmental economic accounting, which is also mentioned in the Pencas House bill that we assisted Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda in preparing based on her initiative the PINRA bill when she was still a senator. So PENCA's bill is now House Bill 9181, and we're very proud that we were able to provide some inputs from our Recovering with Nature group that is co-chaired by Dr. Shell Habito, who is former Socioeconomic Planning Secretary, and Attorney Ipat Luna, a DNR officer who is now detailed in the Office of Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda. We have also received expressions of support in different ways by friends and colleagues. And this one is an important one because it was written by the former Secretary of Education, Department of Budget and Management Minister, Governor of the Central Bank. I think those are his three most important former positions in government. He's now president of a bank, and he wrote this article, Measuring Progress and Well-Being, on July 12 in his column, Wala Lang, in the Manila Bulletin. I hope you will have the chance to look for this, as well as the article that I wrote, in the online platforms of these two newspapers that are leading in our country, the Philippine Daily Inquirer and the Manila Bulletin. So, where are we? The work ahead requires support and cooperation of all policymakers to transform the bill into a law that is in Congress. And after that, that will go to the Office of the President for approval. The Philippine Statistics Authority's staff members and other professionals to adapt the UN SEEC on the Philippine case, and also look at the INVEST software and other methods that are being used at the Natural Capital Project with Stanford University. Business and civil society organizations and ordinary citizens to help in the evaluation in and accounting work, and decision makers and operations staffs of organizations, especially business companies, to treat NatCap as part of the assets they manage. Quoting Dr. Daily, she said there is still a long way to go, but there has been stunning progress toward the transformation of our civilization into an ecological civilization. So, what do we do now? Well, we may either crawl or think, talk together, and act now for our one and only blue planet. I mentioned earlier that we have homework to do. Well, here are two ones. Program, project, and activity that we can think of, especially by the students in college that are assigned to do a lot of research work, including their thesis, especially if they're taking master's and doctoral degrees, on climate change and sustainable development, and or sustainable development. Look at what's happening in your local communities and come up with some suggested programs, projects, and activities that can address the issues and concerns on these two related topics. And we hope that we'll be able to help you in doing that, because our CASA has now about almost 700 members. That's a private group, but it has grown very fast because of the importance of the topic that we are tackling. So we hope that you will consider this recommendation, and we hope to hear from you. The corporate officers, especially in the environment, pollution control officers, sustainability staff members, will also start documenting, or even initiating, if they have not done so yet, initiating and documenting your practices on climate action and sustainability. We hope to be able to produce a book on this, similar to the one that we made on climate change adaptation. And we hope that we can find funding for the printing, but if not, then we will do it electronically. So get in touch with us through our email address, casalliance218@gmail.com. I now would like to acknowledge the support extended to us by our presenters and authors, Deputy Speaker Loren Legarda, our indefatigable champion in our Congress, Professor Gretchen Daily, Dr. Katie Arkema, and Dr. Lisa Mandel, who also spoke at the first video of the Stanford University's NatCap project. Dr. Steve Pulaski of the University of Minnesota and Dr. Gary Peterson of the Stockholm Resilience Center, whom we heard from, but we hope that we will have lengthier discussion from you that we can include in our electronic book soon. My colleagues in photography, which used to be my serious hobby, but I have set aside my camera system for now, trying to learn digital painting in the meantime. Joey De Leon, well, that my name is there also because I produce some of the photos. Josephine Turalba, Tet Lara, and unknown, because I think we got this from free stock photos in the internet, the photo below that I used as a border for our slides. We also thank the sources of maps, graphics, videos, and logos, Dr. Laura David and her teammates, Dr. Borja, Villanoy, and Alino, the United Nations for that graphic on the Sustainable Development Goals 1 to 17. Shell Philippines, as I said, even if they don't realize that we borrowed their original stool image but added one leg to it. The MIT for the 17th Memorial Lecture for Nobel laureate H.W. Kendall, where Dr. Daly gave her last presentation for this episode for the first time. My two children, only son Toby and only daughter Pastor Liz, for helping in doing the logos, and Jed Bilen. Thank you all very much. We hope that we shall hear from you again. Please subscribe to this channel, Climate Action and Sustainability for us, or in short, CAS for you. What's more, episodes on our ecosystem and natural capital accounting ebook, the subject also of the PENCAS bill that we urge you to ask your representatives in Congress and our senators to support its early passage as a law. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat, and we hope to see you again in this program that is jointly being offered to you by CASA, Climate Action and Sustainability Alliance, and SEEC, the Social Enterprise on Education and Communication. Thank you all.